You got a raise this year. Maybe 3%, maybe 4%. Real money. And yet somehow, at the end of the month, it still feels like you have less room than before. Like the raise showed up, looked around, and quietly disappeared. Like you're working harder than you were 2 years ago and somehow still in the same place. That's not a budgeting problem, and it is absolutely not in your head. Here's what's actually happening. The official inflation number, the one you hear on the news every month, called the Consumer Price Index, is calculated by tracking a basket of goods. Prices go up, prices go down. They average everything together, and that average is what gets reported as inflation. And the math is legitimate. But here's the thing nobody actually explains. That basket includes things like televisions, clothing, furniture, and electronics. Things that have gotten significantly cheaper over the last 20 years. And when those cheaper things get averaged in with everything else, the headline number looks a lot more manageable than what most people actually experience. The CPI isn't lying, it's averaging. But the things it's averaging down are mostly things you can choose not to buy. The things it's averaging against? Those are things you can't opt out of. Housing, healthcare, childcare, college. Those 4 categories have been inflating at 2 to 4 times the headline rate for decades. Not in a bad year, as a sustained trend. And those happen to be the exact 4 things that define what it means to have a stable, functioning middle-class life. Now here's the part most people never connect, and this is where the number stops being abstract. The CPI says prices went up around 3% last year. Part of what holds that number down is that a 65-inch television costs less than it did in 2010. That's true. But think about how often you actually buy a television. For most people, it's once every 6 or 8 years. Meanwhile, your rent renews every 12 months. Your health insurance premium shows up every January. If you have children, childcare is a line item that has never gotten cheaper. It just keeps going up, quietly, year after year. The things that got cheaper are things you buy occasionally. The things that got more expensive are things you pay for constantly. That's not a neutral trade-off. That asymmetry is the gap between what the official number says and what your actual life costs. And there's a reason this happened. It's not random. The categories that got cheaper are mostly manufactured goods. Things where technology improves over time, production moves overseas, and efficiency compounds. TVs get better and cheaper. Phones get better and cheaper. Shirts cost less to make than they did in 1990. That's real, and it's good. But the categories that got more expensive are mostly services, and services tied to land, to credentials, to professional labor that can't be automated away. You can't manufacture your way to cheaper housing. You can't offshore your child's daycare. A doctor's appointment requires a doctor. That supply can't be infinitely expanded the way a factory can. So while technology was quietly lowering the cost of things, structural constraints were quietly raising the cost of everything else that actually matters. Let's get specific for a second. Over the last 30 years, housing costs in most American metros have gone up somewhere between 150 and 300% in real terms. College tuition, depending on the institution, has increased 150 to over 200%. Childcare costs have roughly doubled in the last 2 decades. Health insurance premiums have gone up around 50% in the past 10 years alone. And over that same 30-year period, wages for median workers have grown somewhere around 15 to 20% in real terms. Not per year, total, across 30 years. Sit with that for a second. The things a stable middle-class life requires went up 150 to 300%. Wages went up 15 to 20. That gap is what people are feeling when they say they're working harder than their parents did and still feel further behind. Think about what that means in a real household. A family earning a median income in 1990 could reasonably expect to buy a house, have children with one working parent, and afford healthcare without it being a source of constant financial anxiety. That same family, earning the inflation-adjusted equivalent today, is looking at housing markets where prices have tripled, childcare that costs more than college did a generation ago, and health insurance premiums that have become one of the largest line items in the budget. The income didn't fail to keep up because people stopped working hard. It failed to keep up because the math changed, and nobody updated the expectations. And this is where conventional financial advice makes a mistake it almost never admits, because the advice was built for a different math. Most of what you've heard about saving, raises, and budgeting is calibrated to the assumption that wages and costs roughly move together over time. Make sure your raises keep up with inflation. Adjust your budget by CPI each year. These are instructions built around a number that systematically underweights the specific categories that determine whether your life is getting more stable or less. Following them feels responsible, but you're using the wrong ruler. Now here's the part that should genuinely bother you. The things that got cheaper in the CPI basket, electronics, furniture, clothing, are mostly optional. You can have one television or three. You can buy a new jacket or not. The deflation in those categories mostly benefits people who already have their non-optional costs covered. It's nice to have, but it doesn't change your trajectory. The things that got more expensive aren't optional. You can't choose not to live somewhere. You can't decide your child doesn't need childcare if you're working. You can't always decide not to go to the doctor. And for anyone trying to build towards stability, buy a house, raise a family, get an education that pays, these are the categories that dominate the budget and determine the outcome. There's something else underneath this that's worth naming because I think it's where a lot of the psychological pressure actually lives. When your life feels more expensive than the official number says it should be, the natural conclusion is that you must be doing something wrong. Spending too much on the wrong things, not disciplined enough, not smart enough with money. And that belief, I must be the problem, leads to a very specific kind of shame that most people carry quietly and never say out loud. But what if the feeling isn't a signal about your behavior? What if it's actually an accurate read of the real numbers, and the thing that's off is the benchmark you're measuring yourself against? The gap between how stable life feels and what you were told to expect, that gap is mostly structural. It was here before you started making financial decisions, and it will not be closed by being more disciplined about coffee. So the inflation that matters most for a real life has been running at something closer to 6, 8, sometimes 10% per year in the categories that count. And the official number, the one used to evaluate pay raises, to set policy, to tell us whether things are getting better or worse, is using a basket that doesn't reflect that reality for most people. Here's the reframe I want you to sit with, because I think it changes something important. The question most people ask when they feel financially behind is, what am I doing wrong? And that question leads to advice. Budget more carefully, spend less, be more disciplined. That advice assumes the gap is behavioral, that you're the variable. But what if the gap isn't in your behavior? What if the math just actually does not work the way we were told it would? That doesn't mean there's nothing you can do, but it does mean you're solving a different problem than you thought. And solving the wrong problem, very efficiently, is still losing. So here's what's actually worth doing with this. First, stop measuring your raises against headline CPI and start measuring them against your actual cost curve. If you live somewhere rent has gone up 6% a year and you got a 4% raise, you didn't keep pace. You fell behind, even though 4% is above reported inflation. The number that matters is the number that matches your real basket, not the national average, yours. Second, reconsider how you think about the housing decision. The conventional wisdom says renting is throwing money away and buying is always the smarter long-term move. In some markets, that's true. But in a market where housing has been appreciating faster than wages for 30 years, the decision to buy or rent is also a bet on whether that gap keeps widening and on which side of it you want to be. That's a real decision worth thinking through clearly, not just inheriting as default advice. Third, of the 4 categories, housing, healthcare, childcare, education, pick the one most relevant to the next 5 years of your life and look at what its actual inflation rate has been in your city over the last 10 years. Not the national number, your market. That number is the one you're actually up against. Everything else is someone else's math. None of this is, here's how to spend less. It's something more uncomfortable than that. It's that the system you were told you could navigate through by working hard, saving reasonably, and making good choices, that system has a structural gap in it. Not a hidden gap, a visible one if you're using the right data. And the gap isn't in your behavior. It's in the math between what stable life costs and what wages have grown to support. The raise that feels like it evaporated probably did. Not because you spent it wrong, because the things it needed to cover got more expensive faster than the raise could close the distance. And knowing that changes the question. Not, why am I bad at this, but what am I actually up against? And what's the most useful thing I can do from here? That's a better question, and it tends to lead to better answers. If this landed for you, if it put a name on something you've been feeling but couldn't quite explain, drop it in the comments. Tell me which of the 4 categories has felt like the most pressure in your own life: housing, healthcare, childcare, or education. I'm genuinely curious because I think the answer is different for almost everyone, and understanding where people are actually feeling it might be more useful than anything I just said.